Here at Con Thien, near the demilitarized zone, this is Lance Corporal Buddy Mann from Duval's Bluff. Buddy, how long have you been here?
About 36 days altogether.
Have you seen a lot of action during those 36 days?
Just a little bit, not too awful much. A little incoming here and there.
How does it feel to be down in your bunker with all of that artillery coming in?
A little bit shaky. Me, I'm a natural-born chicken.
We understand back home that this was one of the roughest places in the war. Would you agree with that?
I certainly would. It is. It's pretty bad up here.
Could you tell us about some of your experiences since you've been here?
A lot of artillery incoming rounds and mortars. There's not much you can say about it.
Have you had some pretty close calls?
Not too close, but pretty close. I'm still here.
What do you do when you hear those rounds coming in?
You get out just about as fast as you can. Then after they slack up a little bit, you find your hole and keep your head down.
In 1967, the United States Marine Corps was ordered to build a wall across the bottom of the demilitarized zone, a barrier of wire, mines, sensors, and fortified strongpoints meant to seal South Vietnam off from the north. Almost every senior Marine commander involved thought it was a mistake. They built it anyway, and at the northwest corner of that line sat a low hill called Con Thien, only 160 meters high, which over the following months would become the most shelled patch of ground in the country. The Marines who held it did not call their tours there a battle or a campaign. They called it the barrel. The story of Con Thien is usually told as a defensive victory, and on the surface that is what it was. The hill held. Every North Vietnamese attempt to take it failed, and the enemy died in far greater numbers than the defenders. But the more revealing question is not whether the Marines held the hill. It is why they were sitting on it in the first place, absorbing artillery they could not silence, in a static defense that ran against everything the Marine Corps believed about how it should fight. The answer begins not on the hill, but in Washington. To understand the position the Marines found themselves in, the situation along the demilitarized zone in 1967 has to come first. The zone itself was a leftover from the Geneva Agreement of 1954, which split Vietnam at the 17th parallel and laid out a buffer roughly 3 miles on either side of the Ben Hai River. The intent was to keep the two sides apart. The reality was that the North Vietnamese Army, directed by General Von Nguyen Yap, treated the zone as a sanctuary, a staging area, and a supply corridor moving men and materiel south. American and South Vietnamese forces had honored the zone's neutrality. The enemy had not. This imbalance shaped everything that followed, because it meant the North could mass forces and heavy guns just across a line American policy would not let its ground troops cross. The man who decided to do something about that imbalance was Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The concept was a physical barrier below the zone, an anti-infiltration system designed to choke off the flow from the north using wire, minefields, electronic sensors, and a chain of fortified strongpoints. McNamara appointed an Army Lieutenant General, Alfred Starbird, to lead the task force that would design it. The program ran under the cover name Practice 9, and later, as the Marine portion took shape, the Die Marker Project. To the men ordered to build and defend it, the names were beside the point. They called it the McNamara Line, and the naming was not affectionate. What is striking, looking back at the planning, is that the resistance to the barrier came not from junior officers, but from the top of the Marine Command. And it was almost total. General Lewis Walt, commanding the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, instructed his planners to open their report with a statement that his command disagreed with the whole idea and preferred the mobile defense it was already running. Major General Wood Kyle, commanding the 3rd Marine Division, put the operational objection in plain terms. A mobile defense by a force the size of the one envisioned for manning the barrier, he argued, would itself block infiltration south of the demilitarized zone and make the entire construction project unnecessary. When Walt forwarded the plan upward, his cover letter stated flatly that such a barrier was not going to be worth the time and effort it would require. This was the central tension that produced Con Thien, and it is worth dwelling on because it explains the frustration that ran through the entire campaign. The Marines believed in maneuver. Their doctrine, their instinct, and their reading of the terrain all pointed toward mobile operations that found and destroyed the enemy on favorable terms. A fixed line of strongpoints did precisely the opposite. It tied units to ground, fixed them in place, and handed the enemy the choice of when and where to mass his fire. The commandant of the Marine Corps, General Wallace Greene, did not soften it when he testified before the Senate in August 1967. From the very beginning, I have been opposed to this project. The skepticism ran down through the ranks as well. The whole effort to seal the border struck many Marines as hopeless, the feeling being that you could build the zone all the way to India, guard it with the entire Marine Corps and half the army, and the North Vietnamese would still find a way to burrow under it. The opposition changed nothing. McNamara had decided, and in March 1967 he ordered the materials procured. The work was to be operational in part by the 1st of November. By early May, the 11th Engineer Battalion had cleared a 200-meter strip between Con Thien and Jiaoling and begun clearing the perimeters around each. The thing the Marines feared was already happening. The barrier was consuming the division, fixing its units to a line of posts and stripping away its ability to maneuver. General Walt had warned Westmoreland directly that the assignment committed his entire division to the project and would, in effect, end his ability to conduct offensive operations near the zone almost immediately. There were no additional forces available to make up the difference. The barrier would be built with the troops on hand, and those troops would be nailed in place. Con Thien mattered within that line because of what it could see. The hill was unremarkable in height, but it dominated the surrounding plain, and from its summit a man could look 10 miles back to the vast American logistics complex at Dong Ha. Colonel Richard Smith, who commanded the 9th Marines, explained its value in terms no one could miss. A visitor to the outpost could look back at the sprawling supply base at Dong Ha and understand instantly why the Marines had to hold the hill. If the enemy held it instead, Smith said, he would be looking straight down their throats. The hill also overlooked Route 561, one of the principal infiltration routes south, and its capture would crack open Quang Tri province to the tens of thousands of North Vietnamese massed above the zone. A victory there carried propaganda value out of all proportion to the ground itself. The enemy understood the stakes as clearly as the Marines did, and he chose to strike before the barrier could harden. The first blow came in May 1967, and it came against troops the enemy did not know were there. Until the 1st of that month, ARVN soldiers had held the hill, and the North Vietnamese planners who rehearsed the assault did not realize 2 Marine companies from the 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, had taken over. At 2:55 in the morning on the 8th of May, one day past the 13th anniversary of the French collapse at Dien Bien Phu, a green flare went up, and roughly 300 mortar and artillery rounds slammed into the outpost. 2 North Vietnamese battalions, carrying flamethrowers, rocket-propelled grenades, and automatic weapons, blew through the wire with Bangalore torpedoes and pushed inside the perimeter. The fighting fell hardest on Company D and turned into close combat through the night, until an Air Force flare and gunship aircraft the Marines called Puff the Magic Dragon arrived to light the field until daylight. By morning, the attack was broken, and here the campaign offered its first quiet irony. The brush clearance around the perimeter, part of the very barrier work the Marines resented, caught the retreating North Vietnamese in the open as they crossed the cleared strip, where tanks and tracked howitzers cut them down. The defenders lost 44 killed and 110 wounded. The enemy left 197 dead and 8 captured. American observers noted with some interest that the North Vietnamese had attacked the strongest point in the perimeter and kept pressing it even after the resistance proved heavier than expected. It was a rigidity worth remembering, because the same pattern, an enemy committing to a prepared plan regardless of cost, would recur. The May attack triggered the first of the major operations that together made up the battle. The Marines did not simply absorb the blow. On the 18th of May, they launched Operation Hickory, the first large-scale Allied entry into the southern half of the demilitarized zone. This was a significant break from precedent, For years the zone had been a guaranteed sanctuary, and crossing into it announced that the rules had changed. 2 battalions pushed north from Con Thien, while a third was lifted by helicopter into the zone near the Ben Hai to block the enemy's escape. The fighting was heavy. The enemy defended from well-prepared bunkers and trenches, and within the first day a battalion commander was wounded and evacuated and replaced before the day was out. Hickory set the texture of the whole battle. The Marines would find the enemy entrenched, fix him with infantry, and then bring the full weight of supporting arms down on him. Air, artillery, and naval gunfire did most of the killing. Over the operation, the Marines uncovered enormous caches, more than 50 tons of rice and 10 tons of ordnance, and bunker complexes so well built that one had steel walls and overhead cover. The combined operation cost the enemy 789 killed, the equivalent of 2 North Vietnamese battalions. Marine losses came to 142 killed and 896 wounded. The operation had also cleared the barrier zone of its civilian population, which freed the Marines to use their supporting arms without restraint, and it had disrupted the enemy's organization in the zone, at least for a time. What it could not do was permanently deny him the ground. He would regroup north of the Ben Hai, beyond the reach of American ground forces, and come again. He came again in July, and Operation Buffalo opened with the worst single afternoon any Marine rifle company suffered in the entire Vietnam War. On the 2nd of July, 2 companies of the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, were sent north along Route 561 into ground that had been swept only days before. Part of a doomed attempt to break a cycle the regiment could not escape, in which the North Vietnamese simply reoccupied any area the moment the Marines left it. Bravo Company walked into the assembly area of a reinforced North Vietnamese regiment, waiting in prepared positions. In under 7 hours, the company was effectively destroyed, with roughly 60 Marines killed, 2 rifle platoons, and the entire command group wiped out, and the unit earning the name by which the division would remember it, the Walking Dead. That ambush is a story in its own right, and one told in full in a separate video linked in the description and at the end of this one. What matters here is what it revealed about Con Thien. The same terrain the barrier was supposed to control had been turned against the men building it, and the enemy had shown he could mass a regiment inside ground the Marines believed they were patrolling. Buffalo also showed the reverse. What happened when the Marines fought on their own terms rather than the enemy's? And the contrast was total. On the 6th of July, a Composite Company A under Captain Albert Slater set up a concealed outpost northwest of the main body. A 400-man North Vietnamese force, moving in column and unaware of the hidden position, walked directly into it. The Marines opened fire at less than 150 meters. The enemy column hit at its head, raised a bugle call, and scattered in confusion. Concealed positions and fire discipline kept the enemy from ever working out the size of the unit they faced. Marine artillery was walked to within 75 meters of the perimeter. By first light, 154 enemy bodies lay around the lines. The defenders had 12 casualties. The lesson was the one the Marines kept relearning. When they could surprise the enemy and bring supporting arms down on him in the open, the exchange ran overwhelmingly in their favor. When they were channeled into prepared positions, it ran the other way. Operation Buffalo closed on the 14th of July with reported enemy losses of 1,290 dead against 159 Marines killed. More than 500 of the enemy dead were attributed to air, artillery, and naval gunfire, which had expended over 1,000 tons of bombs, more than 40,000 artillery rounds, and 1,500 naval rounds. One first-line North Vietnamese regiment had been wrecked. But enemy artillery had accounted for half of the Marine casualties, and the appearance of surface-to-air missiles fired from north of the Ben Hai signaled that the enemy's capabilities along the zone were still climbing. A single 152mm round drove the point home on the 7th of July when it scored a direct hit on a battalion command bunker at Con Thien, punching through 5 feet of sandbags and timber and killing 11 men. No position within range of the zone was safe, and the range of those guns was growing. The next phase, Operation Kingfisher, ran from mid-July into the end of October and contained both the heaviest shelling of the battle and one of its most costly tactical episodes. On the 28th of July, the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, reinforced with tanks and tracked vehicles, was sent on a spoiling attack into the zone along Provincial Route 606. The terrain funneled the armored column into a narrow strip of land bounded by the Ben Hai River and a tributary stream, and the battalion would have to come out the same way it went in. The North Vietnamese were already moving into prepared positions covering the road, and the Marines could read the warning signs through the night, the sound of truck engines across the river, then digging on the road at dawn. The enemy knew they were coming, and knew they would leave the way they came. The withdrawal on the 29th turned into a running battle that did not end until dark. The Point Squad's leader was killed by a 250-pound bomb buried in the road, and within minutes enemy fire fragmented the armored column into isolated company-sized segments, each fighting its own way through the gauntlet. The tracked vehicles meant to support the infantry became liabilities. Restricted to the road and vulnerable to rocket-propelled grenades, they drew fire, and the wounded loaded onto them were sometimes killed when the vehicles were hit. By the time the battalion fought clear, it had lost 23 killed and 251 wounded. The division would remember it as the armored thrust into the zone, and the rationale offered afterward by the assistant division commander captured the strange logic of it. The purpose, he explained, had been to prove to the North Vietnamese that the Marines could enter the demilitarized zone any time they liked. The proof had been expensive. September brought the bombardment that fixed Con Thien in the American memory. The conditions on the hill made it worse. Con Thien depended entirely on a single supply road that the monsoon rains repeatedly washed out, and the position was large enough only for a reinforced battalion, which meant it was a fixed, undispersible target with a known location on the enemy's gun plots. The North Vietnamese timed a new offensive to coincide with the South Vietnamese elections of the 3rd of September, seeking maximum propaganda effect. On election day, 41 rounds struck the base at Dong Ha and destroyed the ammunition storage area and the fuel farm. On Con Thien itself, the defenders could expect at least 200 rounds on an average day. On the 25th of September, more than 1,200 shells fell on the position. Between the 19th and the 27th, over 3,000 rounds blasted the hill. Men lived underground, and neuropsychiatric casualties, what an earlier war called shell shock, and what was rare elsewhere in the South, appeared here with regularity. The American answer was one of the greatest concentrations of firepower ever assembled in support of a single division. Marine artillery fired more than 12,500 rounds. The 7th Fleet added more than 6,000. Pilots flew more than 5,200 close air support sorties, and B-52 bombers dropped tons of ordnance on the enemy in and north of the zone. The pressure subsided as September ended. The ground assaults that accompanied the shelling all failed to penetrate the wire. The hill held, but holding it had become an ordeal the Marines summed up in their own bleak vocabulary. A tour at Con Thien was a turn in the barrel. The place itself was the meat grinder. When Kingfisher closed at the end of October, the accounting that resulted is the analytical heart of the whole battle. The operation had produced 1,117 enemy killed against 340 Marines killed and 1,461 wounded. Westmoreland described it as a crushing defeat for the enemy. The Marine generals were less sure the arithmetic favored them. Lieutenant General Victor Krulak, commanding Fleet Marine Force Pacific, noted that the Marines had suffered nearly 5,000 casualties in the zone over the year and concluded with Admiral Sharp that the operational benefits being achieved were, in their words, not consistent with the losses incurred. Krulak had described the enemy's design as early as July, and his summary was clear-eyed. The enemy's purpose was to get us as near to his weapons and to his forces as possible, drench us with high-angle fire weapons, engage us in close and violent combat, accept willingly a substantial loss of life for the opportunity to kill a lesser number of our men, and to withdraw into his North Vietnam sanctuary to refurbish. That observation gets at what the body count could not measure. By the metric, Con Thien was an American victory many times over. The enemy never took the hill and lost far more men trying. But the body count was a tool designed to measure progress, and at Con Thien it measured something else. It measured a war in which the enemy set the tempo, accepted casualties the Americans found prohibitive, and fought from a sanctuary that American policy left intact. The northern half of the zone, protected by the United States' own adherence to the line's nominal status, remained available to the North Vietnamese for regrouping and for the heavy guns that did half the killing. It was the frustration the generals kept voicing, and the strategy could not resolve it. The fighting then rolled into a new phase, Operation Kentucky, beginning the 1st of November 1967, and the change was largely cosmetic. To the men on the ground, the operational names meant almost nothing. It was all one continuous battle, and one so-called operation looked very much like the last. The mission stayed the same: hold Leatherneck Square, protect Dong Ha, build the barrier, throw back any North Vietnamese push through Con Thien. The body count remained the yardstick. Kentucky produced fewer set-piece battles and more of the grinding small unit war of patrols, ambushes, and bunker complexes the enemy rebuilt as fast as the Marines destroyed them. It also produced two of the actions that earned the Medal of Honor, both illustrating the same pattern. On the 21st of September, Lance Corporal Jed Barker, a machine gunner already wounded twice, threw himself on a grenade to save the survivors of his squad. On the 14th of October, in the defense of a bridge the Marines named Bastard's Bridge after the unit that bled for it, Sergeant Paul Foster threw his armored vest over a grenade and his body over the vest. Both men were decorated posthumously. Their actions were individual. The circumstances that produced them were structural. Men were dying in the defense of fixed positions because the strategy had fixed them there. One senior commander described that bridge action as an illustration of how American forces were tied to defending terrain and not free to operate, a phrase that could have served as the epitaph for the entire barrier scheme. The last major action of Kingfisher, fought in late October, drove the point home with particular bitterness. The 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, worn down to barely the strength of a reinforced rifle company, was ordered to sweep north. When it halted short of its objective and called for an emergency ammunition resupply, the helicopters revealed its position to the enemy and, worse, delivered far more than was ordered, including 3 pallets of barbed wire the unit could not use or move. The enemy hit the perimeter that night, and command of the battalion passed in succession until Lieutenant Colonel John Stutt was flown in to take over a unit ground down to gaps in its staff. Stutt noted afterward with some bitterness that the regiment had refused to provide helicopters to move the excess ammunition, then had to provide a string of them for emergency medical evacuations that a little more flexibility might have prevented in the first place. The barrier had a logic of its own, and it was not always the logic of the men fighting under it. By early 1968, the barrier was quietly abandoned. On the 20th of January, Generals Cushman and Westmoreland agreed to suspend installation of the linear obstacle system pending clarification of the enemy situation in Quang Tri Province. The Tet Offensive arrived shortly after, and attention moved elsewhere. Cushman later described the ending without ceremony, recalling that he simply stopped building what he called the fence. Tet came along and people had something else to think about. The same general asked years later for his view of the whole barrier concept and operation, reduced it to a single word: stupid. The McNamara line, the scheme that had pulled the 3rd Marine Division onto a string of fixed posts and held it there through the bloodiest months of 1967, was never finished. The division commander later called the Die Marker project a constant burden that influenced almost everything the division did, a thing it could not get free of, and one that had a great deal to do with the 3rd Division being tied to static posts. The Marines held Con Thien until the U.S. Army's 1st Brigade, 5th Infantry Division took over the area, and they left in July 1968. The stated mission, disrupting North Vietnamese infiltration in the vicinity of Con Thien, was judged to have been accomplished. The author of the Marine Corps' own history of the battle, Colonel Joseph Long, who served on the hill as a young radioman and was wounded near Dong Ha in May 1967, offered a careful verdict on why. The mission succeeded in his assessment because of effective small unit Marine leadership and in spite of the strong point obstacle system rather than because of it. That distinction inverts the usual shape of a victory, and it is the right note to end on. Con Thien is remembered as a successful defense, and in the narrow sense it was. The hill held. The enemy was thrown back at heavy cost every time he came. But the position was one the Marines had argued against occupying, defending a barrier their commandant had opposed from the start, absorbing fire they could not answer from a sanctuary they were not allowed to enter. A hand-painted sign once stood at the entrance to the outpost, and it told you exactly where you were. Through this gate passed the world's finest fighting men, the place of angels. The men who held that place won their battle. The strategy that put them there was one their own generals had judged, in private and finally in public, to be a mistake they were ordered to make anyway.
What happened to your squad?
They was hit. Most of them was hit by shrapnel, and there was medevac.
Well, tell me, you came here at full strength?
I had 13 men when I came.
And it's 4 days later now, and how many are still here?
6.
I think we're just occupying ground and losing too many men. I'm losing too many men. If we were to stay here too much longer, we wouldn't have much left of this platoon, let alone the company. I see, what, about 3-4 people get it a day. Not real bad, but enough to be medevac. Cut my platoon down.
Well, isn't that all part of war, as the generals say?
Sure it is, but for 7 months up here, one battalion ain't gonna have much left if that's part of war. That'll rotate a little more, I think. Send us back where we can get new men and train them. See, we're getting new men out here. They coming out, well, what you might call green, and then they don't know really how to act.
The rifles have been jamming, the mud's been, has slowed everything down, and the artillery comes in everywhere, and it just gets pretty futile and frustrating sometimes.
Well, the really depressing part about it is, like, there isn't really much you can do, you know what I mean? You see the rounds come in, you see your buddies get blown away and wounded and stuff like that.
Well, I can't say that I'm scared stiff, but I'm scared. I mean, after a while, you know it's going to come. And you can't do nothing about it. And you just look to God. It's about the only thing you can do.
Well, do you get any idea from up around Con Thien how the war is going?
Yes. If we don't get some more people up in this area real quick, and we don't get some more B-52s real fast, then these people are going to be all the way down to Da Nang before anybody knows it.
Does everybody agree with that?
100%.
When youth was a soldier, and I fought across the sea, we were young and cold hearts of bloody savagery, born of indignation, children of our time. We were orphans of creation and dying in our prime.
What made you write that poem?
Well, just the way things are.